90% of the world's central banks are planning a CBDC right now as we speak. In fact, SWIFT just announced a brand new CBDC platform that's going to be released in 12 to 24 months. If you are someone that values privacy, freedom, and liberty, this should scare the hell out of you. I'm going to explain their plan to control you and your money, and more importantly, I'm going to tell you what you can do to fight back in 3 simple, fast steps. Step number 1, let's go over how the current system works. Notice I put ledgers up here. Very important that you think about today's monetary system in terms of a network of ledgers. That's really all the banking system is. Let me show you what I'm referring to. I've got this Venn diagram, which, believe it or not, was very difficult to draw. Try drawing one of these things one time. My goodness gracious. This in and of itself took me a half hour. But anyway, we've got each circle representing a domestic economy. So we'll just assume for a moment this is the United States, maybe this is Japan, and this is Australia. Each domestic economy has their own central bank, right here in the red, and then within they have these other banks. We'll call them domestic banks, like Wells Fargo, Bank of America. Now, other banks that operate offshore and onshore, we'll call them Eurodollar banks. They're right here with the E. And then above the Eurodollar banks, connecting them, we have the Global Dealer Bank. Okay, pretty straightforward. Now you'll notice that Bank A and Bank A can talk to one another, just like B and C and C. And before we go any further, remember, each one of them has a ledger of transactions. Not only with their customers, but between one another. So they've got this ledger that's showing the retail transactions and the wholesale transactions, if you want to look at it that way. But what happens if a customer of A wants to send money to a customer of B? You see, B is outside of A's network. So they have to use a correspondent banking relationship. Let's say one of these banks in the Eurodollar system. So let's just assume it's between this bank A and this bank B, and it could be a wholesale or a retail transaction. But each one of them are going to have an account with the Eurodollar bank. And therefore, their ledgers, or a piece of their ledgers, are going to be on the ledger of Bank E. Now, let's take it to the next step. Let's just assume for a moment that Bank E, or this Eurodollar bank, needs to do a transaction with this Eurodollar bank. But like A and B, they don't really have a mechanism to talk directly to one another. So they themselves have to use a correspondent banking relationship, and that's when you have the Global Dealer Bank, which also would have a piece of this ledger and this ledger on its ledger. And if you're having a hard time following this, think of it in terms of accounts, just like your checking account. So you have a checking account with Wells Fargo, and let's say your buddy has a checking account with Wells Fargo as well. It makes it very easy for you to send $1,000. You do it via Zelle or something like that, right on your cell phone, and vice versa. He could do the exact same thing, sending you $1,000. But you have to have an account with the same bank. If he has an account with a bank in South Africa, then it's very difficult. You can't do that through Zelle. And this is exactly what I'm talking about. At the end of the day, all that bank account is a bunch of numbers that are on a bank's ledger, the network of ledgers. Okay, getting back to the whiteboard. So what we can see with this Venn diagram, which is a massive oversimplification, but it helps you understand the concepts that are at play, is that each one of these banks have their own ledgers, but there's a lot of overlap. So E has a piece of A, B, and C's ledger, but the global dealer bank has a piece of the ledgers for the Eurodollar banks in this oversimplified system or network. Whoa, time out. Let's look at this one more time. And instead of talking about ledgers, let's talk about accounts like we did earlier, just to make sure we're all on the same page. So if A needs to talk to B, both of them need to have an account with E. And if this E Eurodollar bank wants to talk to this one or this one, they all have to have an account with the global dealer bank. But notice, these domestic banks do not have accounts with the global dealer bank. So there's kind of a layering system with a lot of redundancies. And this is key if you're someone that values freedom, liberty, and privacy. Why is that? Okay, well, if we could just centralize everything, more on that in just a moment, you wouldn't have to go through all of these correspondent banking relationships, and it wouldn't take all this time, and it would be a lot more cost effective to transfer money from one domestic economy to the next domestic economies. There absolutely would be a lot of efficiencies. But for a moment, let's assume that Bank A was trying to send money to Bank B, and they both have accounts with this Eurodollar bank. But the Eurodollar bank said, you know what, A, I don't like you anymore because I've been listening to Joe Biden or Justin Trudeau, and he says that you are a bad guy, or at least your customer is a bad guy. So no, I'm not going to do that transaction. And this bank, or one of these banks, says, okay, fine, you can go ahead and pound sand. Because fortunately, we have accounts with another Eurodollar bank, and this Eurodollar bank has an account with this global dealer bank, which has an account with this Eurodollar bank, which can then send the funds from A to B via this network. It's a roundabout way, but it still solves the problem of getting funds from one point to the next point if one of the intermediaries doesn't want to play ball. And a perfect real-life example of this is when Russia invaded Ukraine. Remember, it was all throughout the news that Joe Biden was going to get tough. The United States was really going to teach Putin a lesson, and therefore we're going to kick him off the SWIFT system. Okay, fine. Did the Russian banks implode? No, absolutely not. They just didn't use the SWIFT system, and because of these redundancies, instead of sending money, let's say to their counterpart in India, through the SWIFT system going through Europe or the European Eurodollar banks, they just rerouted it through the Chinese banks.
Step number 2. Now let's go over what SWIFT's plan is for this new CBDC platform they're calling Sandbox. And again, this is coming out within 12 to 24 months. Getting right to their first simplified diagram, we can see the domestic economies are these orange dotted circles. And just an FYI, they had several participants. In fact, I think 38 central banks participated in this trial run, if you will. And I know a lot of people out there say, well, George, why would the commercial banks agree to this? Well, that's a topic for a completely separate video, but I can assure you a lot of them are. In fact, based on this report, not only did the central banks from Germany, France, Australia, Singapore, the Czech Republic, Thailand, and many others participate in this experiment, they also had HSBC, Citibank, Deutsche Bank, Societe Generale, Standard Chartered, and the CLS FX payment platform. More on that in just a moment. Okay, now getting back to the diagram, we see within each domestic economy, we've got a central bank and the domestic banks, exactly what we're talking about in step number 1, and they are talking to one another. In this case, the banks would have an account, or those ledgers would overlap with the central bank. But in the future, if we have a domestic CBDC, That would mean the non-bank entities in the real economy would also have an account with the central bank. Or they may move their account from their local commercial bank. Let's say you bank with Wells Fargo and you have $1,000 in your account. Okay, well, those $1,000 are your assets, but they're a liability of Wells Fargo. So in the future, with a CBDC, they may move your $1,000 from Wells Fargo over to the Federal Reserve. And you may have an account with both, but you've got the option of moving that to the Fed's balance sheet. And I believe most people will, because they'll likely get a higher interest rate or there'll be some sort of incentive. Okay, but now let's assume for a moment you want to transfer funds to your cousin in Colombia or South Africa. Okay, well, with this domestic CBDC system, it would likely be more efficient, but their central bank, let's say the central bank in South Africa, would have to have an account with the Federal Reserve and vice versa. Okay, so then what happens if that entity is trying to send money to a central bank that doesn't have a relationship with your domestic central bank? Well, you're going to run into the exact same problem we outlined in step number 1, where you'd have to go through a correspondent bank. And you might have to go through 2 or 3 or 4 correspondent banks. So what the SWIFT system is talking about, or this new platform, is where they are creating a new unified ledger where those accounts that are at the local central bank for the bank and non-bank entities in the domestic economy would also be on this unified ledger. And therefore, you're basically eliminating the need for any of these correspondent banking relationships or any intermediary. Why? Because every single entity in the global economy has an account on this one unified ledger. And therefore, if you or the entity in the domestic economy wants to send money to someone else, then all that needs to happen is that SWIFT message goes to the unified ledger, and the unified ledger initiates the transaction. Now, there are a lot of efficiencies at a retail and wholesale level where you're centralizing everything in this CBDC type of monetary system. But you have to ask, at what cost? Of course, there's trade-offs here. And notice there are no redundancies like we had in step number 1, meaning that if you want to transfer money, let's say to the Canadian truckers, because you want to support what they're doing, well, in the past, you might have a way to do that if your bank wanted to take the risk. Because even if they couldn't transfer through their normal correspondent banking relationship, there might be another correspondent banking relationship that they could wire that money through to get to the bank account of whomever you wanted to support. And I'm just using the truckers as a proxy for a money transfer that the government may frown upon in the future. But in a completely centralized system like the one they're proposing, there would be no redundancies. There would be no other alternative routes to get funds from A to B. The central planners, the authoritarians, would have control over that one ledger system. Therefore, they would control every single transaction, every single electronic transaction. In other words, they would control your money and they would control your life.
Step number 3. So how do we fight back? How do we keep our freedom, liberty, and privacy? In fact, how do we create a system where we have more freedom, liberty, and privacy? Well, it starts with understanding the system we have right now. Pretty basic. Joe wants to send money to Ho. He's got to go through that bank controlled by the Federal Reserve, but at least he has an option to go through another bank or another financial institution to get those funds over to his cousin, the average Ho that lives in, well, somewhere in Asia, I'm assuming. And if we think about this in terms of the ledgers right here, these are all banks and they're connected. Now, some of them in the Eurodollar system are not connected to the Federal Reserve or XYZ central bank. Okay, so if this bank wants to send funds to this bank, they've got to go through this daisy chain of overlapping ledgers. And if you want to look at that as this bank has an account with that bank, and that bank has an account with that bank, and these two banks have an account with the Federal Reserve, it's the exact same thing. But now let's look at how they want to change the system. So you can see the average Joe looking pretty upset. Why? Because he only has one option to get those funds to his cousin, the average Ho, and he has to go through the Federal Reserve, which he knows is controlled by Klaus. And of course, we're just using Klaus as a proxy for the global elite, the central planners, and the authoritarians. So if the average Joe does something Klaus doesn't like, not only can he not send the funds, but Klaus can just go ahead and freeze all of his assets. So Klaus would not only control his money, but basically would control his life. So how that looks with the ledgers is the central banks overlap with, we'll call it the centralized ledger of SWIFT, or you might want to call it the Klaus ledger, whichever you prefer. And the banks interact with the central banks, and they could also have an account or overlap with the Klaus ledger. I'm not sure how it will play out, but the bottom line is for the average Joe to do anything, he's got to go through his overlord at the World Economic Forum. So the solution is, of course, the exact opposite of what they're trying to do. And this would be a system where the average Joe right here wants to send funds to the average Ho. But notice, there's no central bank. In fact, there are no banks at all. There's just other ordinary people, other average Joes and average Janes. Because if you step back and just think about it for a moment, you've got to ask yourself, why do we have banks in the first place? Why do I need Wells Fargo to give me permission to Zelle money to someone that just did a job for me? It doesn't make any sense at all. When we realize that all money is just a record on a ledger. So if we can create a system where the record keeping is done by all the individuals in the real economy all over the world, that's all we need to solve the problem. So even if this guy doesn't want to go ahead and update the record on the ledger, well, that's fine, because we've got another million people that will gladly step in and do it, not just in your region, but all over the world. There's no way they can stop this because it's completely decentralized, although oddly enough, we would only need one record. In other words, we'd only need one ledger. But the key is that one ledger wouldn't involve any governments. It wouldn't involve any politicians. It wouldn't involve any central banks, and it wouldn't even involve banks themselves. All of it is updated and completely controlled by the people themselves. Now, I know right about now, a lot of you are saying to yourself, okay, George, I get all of the mechanics and how we do this and what we should try to build, but I mean, give me some actionable advice, some real world examples of what I can do in my own life to transact outside of this crazy system they're trying to build, and to basically give Klaus and all of his cronies the middle finger, which is exactly what they deserve. Well, I've got a solution for you. You see, I'm driving from Santiago, Chile, all the way over to meet my good buddy Doug Casey in Buenos Aires. We're calling it the CBDC Road Trip to Freedom Challenge. And the challenge is that I'm going to try to drive that entire way transacting completely outside of the system using Bitcoin, gold, silver, and most likely some good old-fashioned cash. We'll be live streaming and posting videos on the entire journey. Over at my other channel, Rebel Capitalist, we'll put a link in the description below. So you can watch all the trials, the tribulations, the ups, the downs, and how hard or easy it is to completely transact outside of the system, driving from Santiago, Chile, all the way over to Doug Casey himself in Buenos Aires. But more importantly, it will show you what you need to do right now to be prepared, to make sure that regardless of what comes our way as far as central bank digital currencies, you will be able to maintain your freedom, liberty, and privacy.